Good evening, everybody. My name's Jim Sumberg, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Sussex Development Lecture tonight. I'll be standing in for Lawrence Haddad as the chair. And I want to give a particularly warm welcome to those of you who are joining us online. So it's a great pleasure tonight to welcome our speaker, Michael Woolcock. Michael is based both at the World Bank as a lead social development specialist, and also he teaches at Harvard University in the area of social policy. Michael tells me that he's going to tell us much more about himself and his interests in the presentation, so I'm not really going to spend much more time with that. Just before handing over to Michael, I would like to say that we have a number of people who have signed up to participate tonight online, and as we go through the discussion, if you want to ask a question and so on, please speak up so everyone can hear. And also, for those of you who are joining us online, if you want to ask a question or to make an intervention, you need to use the hashtag Sussex to tweet it through the hashtag SussexDev, if I've done that right. Okay. With that, I'm going to hand over to Michael, and if we think about a 45-minute presentation, we'll have plenty of time for questions. Yeah. And I'll just remind everyone that there's be refreshments in the back after Michael's done. Okay. Over to you.
Thank you. Hi. Thanks very much. Thank you for having me here. I've never been to IDS, despite living in England for 4 years of my life and probably making 50 trips to the UK over my professional life. I've been all the way up to Scotland, all the way out to Dover, up and down the east coast, out to Devon and Cornwall, where my ancestors come from way back when, but I don't think I've been south of Croydon. So this was great to have an opportunity to come and share some thoughts with you today. This is the second day of a pretty crazy week for me, talking about a whole bunch of different things that are in development. Some of you might be perhaps a little concerned that the World Bank's sort of losing the plot by having its research staff going off studying films and novels. Rest assured, yesterday's talk at Oxford was all about methodology and external validity concerns, about the generalizability of our work. Tomorrow's discussions at ODI is all about fragile states and how we try and enhance the capability of states to implement their core agenda. So in some sense, this might initially appear as sort of a bit of a residual category, a bit of a luxury, a bit of a project that one does on the side. And in some sense, it has been that. But it's over the 11 years that I and my two co-authors, David Lewis and Dennis Rogers, have been working on this, it's taken on an interesting life of its own. And from a personal point of view, it's brought me into contact with filmmakers and novelists and people that I would never ordinarily actually interact with in my normal course of life. And so it's something that sort of started off perhaps as a bit of a guilty pleasures kind of project has turned out to be a source of very interesting reflections and very interesting source of new ideas for thinking about this broader phenomena that we call development. So last Monday night, 8 days ago, David Dennis and I did a launch event at LSE for this particular event, and when I gave Lawrence a bunch of options for what he would like me to, what I would like to talk on, or could talk on, he suggested that this would be one that would be of interest to you guys. So I'm delighted that you've come out today and to hear this, and I'll do my best to partly give you a summary of the book itself, but I guess some extended reflections, since I have a bit longer in a more personal capacity to speak about some of the issues and ideas that have come out of that from my perspective. So that's where we're going to go for about 45 minutes or so. If I do my job, I hope to perhaps to stimulate some of your own thinking around this. Let me be very clear in ways that I will reiterate shortly. This is not a summary of world literature or Western literature or anything about that. It's a legitimizing instrument for talking about and thinking about this stuff. And so I imagine in this room we probably have maybe 20 or 30 languages spoken by people from maybe 20 different countries or so. It'd be really great, I think, if we could just do a quick roll call, even at the end of all this, about great novels from the literature that you're familiar with, or great films from the country you come from that you think renders development in a particular way that would be really interesting, not just in terms of perhaps representing that culture, but speaking to the broader either industry of development or the historical processes of development as you have encountered it. And I guess that's in large part the essence of this, of what this whole project has been about trying to look at different realms or ways of which, different epistemological ways in which different communities talk about and make knowledge claims in development, and how those come about. This project began in a Starbucks cafe in 2002, when as you do, you're sitting around talking about stuff you do in development, and the conversation steered in the direction of what novels we just read lately, and then over time this conversation matured more into if we existed only on a diet of articles in the Quarterly Journal of Economics and Journal of Political Economy, what sort of view would we have of what development was like? If we only existed on a diet of World Development Reports and Human Development Reports or any other glossy document that comes out of the development machine, what sort of view would we have of development? And I was delighted to see, just on the way in here, you have a nice little fiction collection outside in your own library. And sort of, is that there just for a bit of light relief, a bit of entertainment, or I hope that one could see that as a really distinctive collection or embodiment of this rendering of this issue called development. And partly this project is really trying to say that the diversity space that we otherwise encourage demographically, diversity that we otherwise encourage in terms of disciplines, can and I think should be extended to the realm of different genres of idea rendering, some of which comes through in our work that we do as social scientists, as scholars. Some of it comes through in the work that we do when we're writing summary reports or advocacy documents. But I think novelists and filmmakers, and by extension a lot of other artists, have very interesting things to say about development that on its own terms can and should be taken very seriously as a source of knowledge claiming in development. And I will try and give you some of the ways in which we've tried to explore that in our book. So this is this nice cover that we did. Comes from a sort of a montage of various different things that we've put together. But what I want to do is sort of open with a discussion around what I think this book is and is not about. So just to sort of set, I think, expectations right from the start, which is an important thing in life and in all matters. Then I want to talk about what I think is the comparative advantage, as it were, of thinking about development through this popular representational lens. What distinctive insights do we get from novels and from films that we just can't, or at least get very inadequately, when we try to capture this in a regression model, or when we try to do it through in policy speak, in language of development agencies, and the ways in which that would tend to frame issues. Then I want to talk about why it's interesting and why it matters for scholarship, and we'll talk about some of the interesting ways I think in which indeed popular culture itself has in the past and is today contributing to scholarship, not as an add-on or a commentary on scholarship, but actually as a serious and bona fide way of contributing to our storehouse of knowledge about particular issues. Then how it's important for thinking about what I would call a sort of a well-rounded education and development. Without wanting to sound like a grumpy middle-aged guy, my concern is that we have set up development increasingly as a field in which people are incredibly well-trained and very poorly educated. In the sense that people are very good in a technical sense about mastering the particular tools and techniques of data analysis, etc., but are almost tragically ignorant of a lot of the broader ways in which these processes of social change and exclusion have and can be rendered through very different modalities. And in my perhaps slightly old school way of thinking about education was about taking all of those seriously and trying to figure out in ways that it's often not obvious how a more coherent and integrated view of these different domains can be done. And finally, I want to talk about this not just as an avocational thing, as something we do on the side or that we kind of have to apologize for, but as something that is and actually can and should be part of our own diet, part of the material that we feed into our heads as we try and engage with new countries, new issues, or indeed countries in which we're very familiar with and ones that we've been working on for a long time. One of the upsides of this project, as I mentioned before, is that once I found myself talking about this to various different people, some very senior people sometimes, it's been a wonderful moment when these people have sort of looked around and then sort of leaned forward and whispered to me, actually, like Pranav Barden, for example, one of you may know, one of the very eminent economists at the University of California, Berkeley. He sort of confessed almost in a tone of confession over dinner one night that he actually watches a Bengali film every single day of his life. Partly to sustain his Bengaliness, but partly because he turns out this very serious economist is also a huge film buff. And what he learns about his country and his culture through films, through Sajid Ray and all the great Bengali filmmakers, just provides him with input into his life that he just really can't get any other way. And he was kind of always one of my favorite economists before that. Now he's a rock star in my world because he's doing this kind of stuff. And it turns out actually that a lot of people will confess in using a language almost of confessional that they really enjoy reading novels. They really enjoy seeing how other countries represent themselves to themselves and to each other. And I guess, as I said, this book doesn't claim to have a sort of master summary of all of this stuff. It wants to legitimize that as a way of gaining better knowledge of any particular group or particular sectors, or more generally of the development process itself. So, just to reiterate, the book is not sort of an overview of Western or certainly the world sort of view of literature, cinema and television. We're acutely conscious from the moment we went into this domain that we were very quickly up against the limits of our linguistic and cultural expertise, and so the sheer time it would take to even do a small slice of one country's literature. So there's no claim here at all that this is some big synthesis of any of this stuff. It's certainly not, as some people in a reflexive way when they first heard us talking about this stuff think that we're making some claim of epistemological equivalence, that it's just as well, we can just as easily make policy on the basis of the work of poets and filmmakers as we can from statistics and the census data and serious econometric kind of work. That's not categorically what we're saying here. And nor is it an analysis of the incidence or the meaning of key development words as they have occurred in development over time. And I'll have a slide in the next one where I'll look just very interestingly at some people that have tried to do that. And I think it would, in fact, be interesting to look at how the meaning of words has risen and fallen over time, and why a word like destitution, for example, was once very much the language in which we talked about poverty, but is now not used. So how are these meanings changed? And that's how one could be more niche and more specialized, perhaps, in doing work in this kind of space. But really what we want to try and do is just look at as development scholars and as development practitioners at the very unique way in which the artists of the world render this phenomena of development, and how and why and in what ways that is similar to or different from the normal bread and butter, the normal diet that we have as policy people and as academics, where we're largely thinking about a next publication for the next journal, the next book, the next monograph that we're going to do, getting a next grant. It tends to conditionalize us to think about these particular issues in particular ways. So we're not making any sort of equivalence claim here in more economics kind of language. These are all complements, not substitutes. They are very much things that we think can and should be held together. So just to use one example of what someone has actually done when they try to look at poverty counts in literature, my former boss Martin Ravallion, in his very Martin-esque kind of way, once he discovered the ways, the wonders that Google could be used for in searching, turns out you can search the entire corpus of scanned literature, of Western literature over the last 200 years, and get this sort of incidence of the number of times the word poverty appears as a percentage of the total words ever published in that particular year over a 200-year period. Right? So some economists, you can imagine, getting all gooey about what you can do with this stuff. It turns out, as per this paper that Martin's done, that there are these two poverty enlightenments. Sort of in the late 1700s, there's this sort of incidence around the periods around the French Revolution, the American Revolution, etc. Then a sort of second one now, essentially. So anyway, but that's not what this book's about. I just thought that was cool. If you're a nerdy graph math, counter or that sort of thing, you can actually do stuff like this in this domain as well. But that's not what we're going to do. What we are going to do is to talk about ways in which we can take seriously these different popular expressions of development, and look at how we can open up alternative modalities for conveying complex and controversial ideas. Part of the initial discussion for this came about because we learned that we were using some of this stuff just instinctively in our teaching. We were, especially for undergraduates who might be really new to a lot of these ideas, and I'm pretty sure most people in this room don't have any visceral lived experience of sustained deprivation. It's not for most of us something that we've actually experienced before. So if that's true for your average 18 to 19-year-old who is even further removed than us from this kind of historical experience here in the UK or elsewhere in the West, is there ways in which we can read Dickens, for example, in ways that helps people to re-engage with some of these earlier periods when what we now formally study through poverty was being rendered for the first time in very popular mediums, such as the novels that he was writing. But we'll come back to some of that stuff later on. The book itself is largely structured in around these seven different parts. We have the standard sort of introduction where we summarize various different themes that emerge from the book. But we then have a look at, first of all, using a reprint of a paper that Dennis and David and I did that came out of that fateful Starbucks meeting called The Fiction of Development. And some of you may have seen that. It was published very nicely, thank you JDS, here in 2008. And that was sort of the first time we made a more serious stab at trying to look at what novels have to say about development. I'll come back to some of that in a bit later. What we also did though was, as I said, we very quickly realized in this project that we had reached the limits of our time and our capacities and our even potential to engage with this stuff. So put out an open call for people that might be interested in responding to this issue in their own particular way. And one of the first and most interesting ones that we got was from a woman doing a content analysis of the World Bank's own attempts to try and create magnas, which are a form of cartoons essentially that are trying to take very big issues in development, like AIDS for example, and trying to produce these nice reader-friendly, youth-friendly representations of these issues. Now obviously when you're taking a wildly complicated issue like AIDS and you've got 5 minutes to crunch this down into sort of a cartoon form to disseminate to the masses, hard decisions have to get made about what's in and what's out, what counts as a question, what counts as an answer. And she did a really nice sort of content analysis of how this issue is being framed when push comes to shove, when you can't have qualifiers and footnotes to note all the exceptions, etc., etc. How does the World Bank talk about something like poverty reduction or talk about AIDS when forced to represent this in a cartoon for hundreds of millions of people, as opposed to the 100 people that maybe at best read the articles that we publish in more obscure journals. Right? So that's part of what we were trying to do with that. Then we looked at some of the other even more contemporary popular ways in which not just development, but poverty in particular was being rendered in popular culture. People who are specialists, for example, of urban violence in the United States, who study this for a living, have routinely said that The Wire, the HBO television program The Wire, has captured the essence of that research probably the most faithfully that anybody has, and was sort of in the pantheon of great television series. People will usually say that The Wire is one of the greatest of all time. It turns out that if there's entire courses you can take on The Wire in media and studies programs around the world. So we might not think this is initially sort of development, but it's really interesting as a way of looking at, for those of us that haven't grown up in slums or had to deal with corrupt police on a day-to-day basis, how do we encounter those issues when we watch a television show like The Wire, in all its grittiness and all of its profanity and all the rest of it? How is a show like that able to capture the essence of what those particular issues are about and what people caught up in that experience on a day-to-day basis? We had one on reality television shows, the world's worst parents, where these people are taken to different countries around the world and try to live with other people. So, when that's, again, inherently simplistic but very powerful rendering of how other cultures are presented back to British audiences here in the UK, what does that look like, right? You've got to make hard decisions. You've got 5 minutes to sort of talk about Jamaica, for example. What does Jamaica become when 10 million viewers are watching a show like that? How does the civic consciousness start to form around these issues when, as I said, the diet for your average citizen is not what you and I read, but is actually these types of television shows. We have 2 chapters in there on the next one on films. David and Dennis and I did one that came out last year in JDS called The Projection of Development, which is what we think we learn from films. And I'll come back to that again later on. But another one of our authors was Indian and did a really interesting analysis of early Indian, the post-colonial moment films in India, and how IAS officers, the civil servants, were talked about and rendered in the post-colonial period. Right? These guys are essentially the heroes of the nation. They're the future people that will be remembered as the great leaders of their society. When you go fast forward to a popular movie now, like Slumdog Millionaire, for example, literally every single character in that film is venal, corrupt, and a nasty piece of work. Right? So how do we go over this period of time from when civil servants, when public officials were rendered in the public imagination as the fathers of the nation, and the solution, as it were, now they're the problem. Now they're the people that have to be overcome and have to be beaten down, have to be thwarted or retrained or whatever in order to be able to make development go on. So, this way in which the popular imagination both reproduces and reflects these different aspects of development, I think, are really important. I would love to see a paper, for example, comparative study done on Hollywood, Nollywood, Bollywood, right? How do Nigerians talk about development in ways that Indians don't? And these crazy white people that show up in jeeps and drive around their country and dispense advice about accountability and transparency. How do those characters appear in Indian films versus how they are filmed in Nigerian films? I have no clue, but I reckon it'd be really, really interesting to look at it, because I think you'd learn a lot about what we look like when we're doing this thing called development in other countries. Right? So I think that's the kind of stuff I would love to legitimize through this kind of work. Not that we have the answer to it, but I want other people to feel like that's a really interesting problem. I would like to go and study it, and these kind of books help to make that a thinkable, sayable, and doable thing. The next ones we have around public campaigns. Uma Kataria, my former colleague at Manchester, is a great student of the Empire Marketing Board, a group that existed in the late 20s, early 30s here in the UK to try and promote essentially a Buy British campaign as the 20s came to an end and the Depression started to kick in. A big initiative to try and prop up the UK economy by encouraging people to buy their tea in particular from the Empire. So Buy British, sustain the Empire became a really big deal. But in a haunting presentation that's actually probably better in this sort of modality rather than on print, but she has a very arresting series of images juxtaposing the fair trade campaigns of today, for example, with the empire marketing boards of yore, right? 80 years or so difference in the way these campaigns are being structured, but a haunting similarity between how indigenous and domestic populations are represented, the very narrow, constrained ways in which the emotional lives of many of these people are portrayed. Very happy, very sad, or very super determined. Those are sort of the tripartite emotional lives of people, of citizens of developing countries, as rendered through the popular literature way back when, but even the popular literature now. So when you look at the campaigns that are, or the renderings of development issues in the Tube, when you look at it at the church perhaps you go to through fair trade campaigns, this is how millions of people encounter development. It's not how we encounter it, because we are the development industry, but it's how a public consciousness or our political space is created and sustained for development. It's largely fed through those kind of processes, and I think it's really interesting and important that we be as savvy in our analysis of and contribution to these kinds of campaigns as much as we are to our own particular scholarly work. Finally, and because we're in an age of, indeed this presentation is being connected up through Twitter, there's one of the hopes, or at least one of the big hype claims around development now, is that these new forms of social media are going to radically democratize development. They're going to provide these opportunities for rapid feedback so that we can greatly improve the quality and the range of voices that are contributing to the policy discourse around development. So it turned out there's some interesting people who actually study this. We didn't know about it, we found them. And they have tried to, as carefully as they can, actually do a content analysis around the Millennium Development Goals, for example, a international big conversation, and sort of before and after the advent of social media, and has the Twitterization of development discourse indeed, as one would hope, sort of vastly expanded the number and range of voices, or has it just really amplified the volume but just essentially been presenting us in digital and 140 character forms essentially the same version of the conversation that we would be getting otherwise? Alas, at least according to these guys, it's much the latter. It's essentially just an amplified form of what we already have been hearing around this stuff, not, as we might hope, a more open and diversified set of voices. Nonetheless, that's the kind of stuff that we've been trying to put into the domain. This is all done, I should stress, with zero research funding from anybody, so our impact is infinite on a per dollar basis. But as I said, and I will come back again to saying, it's what we really wanted to do was just to open up and present this sort of as a second word on an issue, certainly not the last and not the first, because other people, as we'll see shortly, have been making similar kinds of claims in different fields of inquiry for a while. But we don't have this done in development, and so we really wanted to open up that space for these kind of conversations. So let me do what I think is the comparative advantage of this. Why would we want to do this kind of work? Well, part of it, I think, is that it helps to really build a sense of perspective and empathy via stories and allegories that we just don't have we don't often have as a serious modality of communication today, but which for essentially every group that's ever existed in human history has in fact been the way in which we've talked about ourselves and to other people. And so a large part of this business, it seems to me, given that, again, most people in this room don't have any visceral experiences of deprivation and material poverty and hunger. As it has always been, one of the great contributions of literature has been to help put yourself in someone else's shoes. The great sociological idea of Verstehen, of being able to take the role of the other, by being able to see what the world looks like from somebody else's perspective. And I think that's probably the signature accomplishment of probably why we read novels, but in a more strategic sense, I think it's how it has always been. And this is an idea that goes back thousands of years in recorded human history, whether it's talking about the Bible or about the famous blind men and the elephants parable, which it turns out, which I'd always thought was just an Indian thing, it turns out to have come through a whole different range of different religious traditions and being almost reinvented in different religious traditions. The idea, as I'm sure you're familiar with, that the truth can never ever be understood just by simply extrapolating from the basis of your narrow own perspective. We inherently want to extrapolate, like the blind man and the elephant, from touching a tail and thinking that therefore the whole elephant is a snake, or the leg and thinking it's a tree trunk. But the essence of this very powerful allegory through human history is that whatever we encounter, whatever part of that elephant we feel, there's something way bigger out there than that we can't really ever understand unless we start to pull together these very different ways of knowing, these very different forms of knowledge claiming. Right? So this is an ancient idea from the 9th century onwards. People, humanity, our forebears have had a long-standing appreciation that the vastness of knowledge and the world and of human experience could never be captured through a single modality, whether it be a discipline now or whether it be through a different genre of communication. It was always a more complete picture, the extent we were able to incorporate this from a range of different ways, a range of different perspectives. As it turned out, one of the serendipitous discoveries of this was being able to come across a wonderful interview that was done with the Victorian novelist George Eliot back in the 1850s. And she was asked by some snarky reviewer, essentially, why are you bothering writing novels, right? You could be running, in contemporary terms, you could be running around collecting hard data to try and prove to government officials that this thing called poverty is real, right? If you only had this data, then this would change how the world thinks. And she has this brilliant response where she basically, she says in ways that we just don't speak like, but I'm going to read it because I think it's wonderful. And appeals founded on generalizations and statistics require a sympathy ready-made, a moral sentiment already in activity. But a picture of human life, such as a great artist can give, surprises even the trivial and the selfish into that attention to what is apart from themselves, which may be called the raw material of moral sentiment. Right? No one talks like that anymore, but that's wonderful, right? I mean, it's a very powerful argument for why we do this, because to engage with things like statistics, there's a whole apparatus you have to understand already to be able to do all this stuff. But then the rest of the interview is all essentially a discussion, and this echoes very similarly what Dickens responded when he was asked the same kind of questions. Why are you floating around writing these cute little novels? Why can't you do real work? Right? And his argument was, most of the real poverty in the world is caused by rich people who are just blissfully ignorant that what they are doing is built on the back of the poor, and they have no clue about that. And the only people who are going to the only way to change these people's minds is to take them into a world. They are impervious to rational argument. The only way is to get them, to transport them into a whole different space where they can see the world in a very different way. And in essence, that's what he said, that's what Eliot said, and what the great novelists and artists of our time and of previously have said about this is what their vocation is, to be able to create a different space for us to enter so that we can see the world in very different kind of ways. And I think that, for me, is one of the most powerful justifications for this. But it doesn't end in the 19th century. Joseph Conrad, in the famous in preface to his short story, The Nigger of the Narcissus, my task which I am trying to achieve is, by the power of the written word, to make you hear, to make you feel. It is before us to make you see, right? Helping people to hear, to see, and to feel, right? That's what great artists can do. That's why you cry when you watch a movie, when you cry when you read a novel, because it's affecting your emotional life. It's taking you to places that, unless you're a total geek, most of us probably don't cry when we read regression tables, right? It doesn't, unless it's spending your whole life trying to get the data to work, and it doesn't, but that's not that same sort of thing, right? It's transporting you, right? And I think that's entirely legitimate as a basis for the different ways in which we bring all these different things together. And a series of other things. But even today, in contemporary social science, a wonderful political scientist at Michigan, Scott Page, has got a fantastic book which I encourage you to read, called The Difference: How the Power of Diversity Creates Better Groups. It's got everything in there, from game theory to Greek models to statistics to everyday anecdotes, to really demonstrate to the satisfaction, I would think, of every social scientist in this room, that really amazing things happen when you figure out, when you take this parable of the ancient India, that the parable of the elephant, seriously, and are able to integrate it. They can do wonderful experiments by getting people to solve math problems far faster through 20 people with a high school education than someone with a PhD in math, by just putting it out to a group of people. And that collective intelligence is much faster than even one specialist. Right? So cute stuff like that. The whole book is an ode to the wonders of what happens when you're able to integrate these seemingly very disparate forms of knowledge knowledge and make it all come together, right? And I think that's what this kind of work does. Perhaps the most powerful and compelling version of this comes from Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, the author of Half a Yellow Sun, which I was delighted to see is on your reading collection out in the fiction books out there. Right? Her TED Talk called The Danger of the Single Story has been downloaded as of last count over 5 million times. Right? That's 5 million people that have watched a 15-minute presentation, which I thoroughly encourage you to watch, and it was probably a better 15-minute stretch of my time to watch, suddenly segue into watch that rather than just listen to me for another 15 minutes, but an incredibly impassioned position about how history is told, about how the story of a people, in her case the Nigerian people, has been told to the world through a particular lens, and how a different kind of story, which might not necessarily be better, nonetheless helps us ultimately to get a richer rendering of all of this stuff. Right? 5 million people watch that. Another 10 million or so have bought her books. And if we get all excited in our world, we get maybe 50 or 100 people citing our papers. Right? So this is how very powerful renderings of very elementary development issues are being conveyed to most people most of the time. And I think we need to engage with that. Now, to shift a little bit, one of my favorite development films is Tambien Aluvia, a Spanish film. Who's seen it? How many people in the room have seen it? Oh, if I was here on a Friday, only one person. If I was here on a Friday night, I'd order pizza and we'd all come in and watch it. It's the opening half hour of my class at the Kennedy School is spent watching some scenes from this movie. My favorite for looking at what a film can do to look at very different perspectives on this thing called development. Without giving away anything, I think it's the beauty of this film is it's a film about a documentary about a movie. It's about a group of guys in their mid-30s. It's clear that this is their make or break film for their whole career. Have decided they want to recreate the Christopher Columbus settlement in Santo Domingo. Except it's very clear from the outset that we're not in Santo Domingo, we're in Bolivia. And why are we in Bolivia? Because the natives are way cheaper for their filmmaking purposes. And you can see where this is going, right? Essentially, the story is, colonialism was brutal and nasty back in the 1490s. It's not necessarily horribly brutal and nasty now, but the same people put under enough pressure can still do pretty nasty things to one another. And the subtext to this particular movie is that what's going on in the background while they're actually making this movie is the Cochabamba water riots, which are a series of coordinated protests that were launched in the year 2000 as a response to and programs supported by the IMF in particular that were all about trying to privatize water in the interest of efficiency and government revenue. And the whole title of the film is that for villagers, even the rain, right? Even the rain could be commodified. There was nothing sacred anymore. These Philistines essentially were coming into their world with wielding fancy cost-benefit analyses to be able to kind of convince them that water was just a commodity like anything else, and the most optimal and rational use of this was to buy it and sell it like any other commodity. And there's a wonderful scene which is magic when you're showing it at Harvard, because the mayor of the town who's overseeing this and thinks, because it happens to play into his own political interests, says, and we've even got experts from Harvard that have proved to us that this is the right thing to do. Right? That's kind of chilling when you're teaching that at Harvard, to think, yeah, that's how you're being played by people who are smarter than you are in terms of how the local domestic political economy often transpires. But a wonderful film by being able to try and tell you a historical narrative overlain with a simultaneous story going on about Cochabamba water riots, interspersed with sort of scenes at the end of the day when the actors are not being actors anymore and they're themselves having to reflect on the sort of weird thing that they're simultaneously playing a character from the 1490s and witnessing this riot go on all around them. And it's never quite clear when you're watching this whether when you're talking with or seeing this character talk, whether he's a character from the 1490s, a character who's making a film about the 1490s, or he's just a citizen a little perplexed about what's going on. Right? Fantastic movie for talking about how the same event can be talked about from very different perspectives and understood in ways that then lead to great contests. Umberto Eco does this with a lot of his great work, the Name of the Rose being the most celebrated one. Exactly the same events, interpreted through a different lens. The evidence is the same, the theory in which it is understood leads to these wildly different interpretations of what's going on. Right? So once you think about that in a slightly more analytic kind of level, I think the implications of a lot of that stuff are very profound. That the evidence is not self-evident, for example. The evidence is only ever understood through a particular series of assumptions, a particular theoretical apparatus which helps to make sense of that evidence, and imagining that our job in development, as some people would have us to believe, is just to narrow down on what the evidence suggests. It's actually very pernicious, and these kinds of movies demonstrate way better than any other medium I can think just how powerful that is when these events can be rendered simultaneously for the viewer's pleasure. Now, this is not a sort of an entirely new venture that we've pursued. If you're a sociologist, you may, with a long good memory, there was a wonderful series of articles that Lewis Kozer put together 50 years ago, called Sociology Through Literature, which he prepared as an undergraduate text, which is looking at all these mainstream ideas in sociology, but looked at how it was all conveyed in everyday literature. More recently, and it turns out there's actually a whole subfield of this in law, the wonderful rendering of all what you learn about modern justice, or the theory of justice, or jurisprudence, and the different domains that the law intersperses purely by reading Shakespeare's plays. Really good stuff there. Fantastic. If you're a student of causality, if you spend your life stressing out about whether your identification is cool enough to persuade your economist bosses to get it published in some nice journal, I complement that worrying with a wonderful book called A Cultural History of Causality, which looks at how the last 200 years about what constitutes a causal claim has morphed over time, using as his empirical reference murder mysteries. Right? So when novelists were writing about murder and trying to write stories about causal processes, an early 18th century novel on murder and causality, because it inherently represented the zeitgeist of the moment about what constituted a legitimate causal modality, is very different from early 20th versus late 20th. Right? No one commits a nihilistic murder, sort of randomly pushing someone else out of a train, for example, until Camus and other people have come along with sort of a postmodern renderings of life that sort of enable people to think about causality in these very different kinds of ways. But a very different way of doing this, I think, and this, I preluded this before, is the fact that this stuff doesn't just have to be an add-on to the side. It doesn't have to be commentary. How many of you have seen Lincoln, the movie Lincoln? Great. Now, if you're watching the credits at the end of that movie, you would have seen that this movie is based on Doris Kearns Goodwin's Team of Rivals, right? And it's kind of notionally is. But it turns out, and I didn't know this until I had read what I'm going to read to you shortly, that what you're seeing in that film is actually quite a novel historical interpretation of an event, of a series of events that has vexed historians of the Civil War since the Civil War. Namely, why did a guy who just won election to be president for another term suddenly get so obsessed in the first few months of 1863 about passing a law to end slavery? He had an even bigger mandate coming a few months later. Why on earth did he double down on this particular period and twist arms and do all this crazy stuff to make it happen? And it turns out that there is a particular explanation, a particular theory and some evidence that Doris Kearns Goodwin presents in her historical account of that. But other people who are way more literate than certainly me and a lot of other people about this issue recognize that actually what they were watching on the screen was the first time anyone had actually presented this particular explanation for why Lincoln had done this particular series of acts. And it turns out that this particular historian, Philip Zelikow, who's at the University of Virginia, was seeing this and was transfixed as a historian, less sort of as a moviegoer, as a historian, because he was seeing actually novel scholarship being presented to him before his eyes, but not at some American Historical Association conference, but in a film. And what does he say? Because filmmakers can often devote far more resources to research than scholars can, because the sheer process of a painstaking reconstruction of a past world can itself yield insights about it. It has always been possible that filmmakers might add to our collective historical understanding rather than either popularizing or debasing it. In Mr. Spielberg's Lincoln, that possibility is happily realized. Which is to say, when in fact you've got a $150 million budget to be able to make a film, and you can recreate in its exactitude the costumes, the accents, the characters, the political dynamics, phenomenologically, you learn something about what was going on that you could never have got just by dusting off archives from an obscure library somewhere and trying on the basis of a few shards of paper to try and recreate that world. Recreating the world itself can actually put you phenomenologically in a different space for thinking about some of that stuff. Now, I really like that because I just think that's kind of interesting, but it turns out that other people have made similar kinds of arguments. If you look at Lynn Hunt's book, Inventing Human Rights, it's just a fantastic book around how we went from a world of routinized judicial torture and slavery in 1740 to liberty, fraternity, equality, and a self-evident truths about the equality of human beings. She argues very powerfully that novels were both invented and helped to contribute to a whole shift in popular consciousness about what was acceptable by writing stories that took the elites who were the dominant decision makers about all these issues into a different space where they could feel, where they could see and hear, a la Conrad, what judicial torture was actually like to people, or what even more prosaic forms of constrained decision making in the case of works by Richardson or Fielding or Rousseau, which were novels by men about young women trapped in loveless marriages, how all of these collectively helps to transform, in this case very quickly, a whole set of ideas that had existed for centuries around how we should treat each other. Right? So these things don't just have to be add-ons or luxuries, they can themselves, under certain circumstances, which itself is, I guess, is an issue for scholarly inquiry, under which popular movements and popular ideas start to shift because of not just social activism, but social activism expressed through everything from political campaigns through to the novels that people watch. I think from a teaching point of view, we can certainly use these different forms of literature and filmmaking to help us explain and demonstrate the salience of particular, otherwise seemingly very specific concepts, or very sometimes even very buzzword kind of topics in development, but that we use, like poverty traps and all those kinds of things. But I think there's those kind of issues can be often addressed far more powerfully and quickly through popular mediums. Counterfactuals, for example, which is one of these big things that we've all discovered in doing evaluation research, for example. Trying to explain what a counterfactual is to your mother might be a little hard, all right? But ask her to, like for my wife, who we sit down every Christmas in the United States to watch a fantastic classic American film called It's a Wonderful Life, right? It's a Wonderful Life is all about counterfactuals, and movies can demonstrate counterfactuals in ways that we never can. Even if we're doing RCTs, we can't demonstrate a counterfactual. Right? By definition, we can't do this. Movies can. Run Lola Run, a fantastic German film, is all about that. Sliding Doors is all about counterfactuals, right? So these simple little things that movies can do to demonstrate the life in the world where the doors and the tubes sit in front of you versus the ones where they don't. And you can creep yourself out pretty quickly by that, having those kind of experiences too often. But probably the best, most recent book for the popular audiences around poverty is Catherine Boo's multi-award-winning book, Behind the Beautiful Forevers. And just one particular passage that I think comes out of that's really powerful in its own right, but that could actually be used to talk about sort of more formal social scientific principles as well. It seemed to Abdul that unawadi fortunes derived not just from what people did or how well they did it, but from the accident catastrophes that they avoided. A decent life was the train that hadn't hit you, the slumlord that hadn't offended, you hadn't offended, the malaria you hadn't caught, right? So oftentimes, we now talk about that we're wanting to increase things, right? From at least this type of rendering of poverty says, in the most destitute and desperate situations, it's what you avoid happening that becomes how you do good things, right? So if you wanted to formalize that in social science, it's what we would call an asymmetric variable. Right? It doesn't just move up and down a neat scale in reciprocal kinds of ways. Moving from nothing to something creates one thing, but moving from something to having nothing at all, or having less than nothing, having it being overtly stolen or taken from you, moves in a different direction. Anna Karenina opens up with the memorable passage about all happy families are the same, but all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. Right? That's the opening of a 600-page book. But from a social science methodological perspective, I hope you read that and think, wow, that's a very profound statement about the way that different variables move. Right? Maybe that's what I worry about when I read these things, but I think that's actually really, I've read, if you read Nancy Cartwright's most recent book, or if you read Jim Mahoney's, Gary Gertz's book, where they make a whole chapters all around the the weird stuff that happens with these things called asymmetric variables, saying, just quote Anna Karenina and it's all clear. Right? Everybody gets that. There is convergence in certain directions amongst in functional spaces, and when you push it and undo it, it doesn't just become the opposite of that, it actually goes out into these very divergent ways. Anyway. Right? Nonetheless, the point is that I think, at least in Catherine Boo's case, this was an interesting hybrid. It wasn't just her own novelistic interpretation of things. If you look at the appendix to that book, there's a whole long list of formal academic sources that she consulted that contributed to her capacity to be able to write a book like that for tens and hundreds of millions of people. That was able to take mainstream social science, wrap it in her own experience and her own great skill as a novelist and writer to be able to communicate for the rest of us who don't live in the slums of Mumbai what that life is like, and to transport us. Again, this whole idea of seeing, of feeling and hearing things that we just are otherwise unable to do. One of the other riffs we have in the book is just about sort of the political economy of these different renderings, whether independent films, for example, are inherently in a better position to be able to speak truth to power than Hollywood blockbusters. I think that would be an interesting issue. Look at what the publishing, the politics of publishing does to what does and does not come across our screens and across our Kindles when we're looking at the economics and the politics of how these things work. That's a minor kind of issue. Let me finish just with three other sort of big picture things that I think are really central to what novelists can teach us. And apart from this transporting, this seeing, hearing and feeling central idea. Another one I think that is central development practice is this whole notion that about aid as not just as a political exchange, but in a more elementary sense perhaps as an idea of giving and receiving, and about how that dynamic works. So understood, I think the act of giving and receiving has a very ancient quality to it. Around every group that's ever existed, there has been an anthropology of giving and receiving. And I think we often, in the development, don't see what we're doing as that. We just see ourselves as sort of trying to provide tools or instruments that we think work to help fix the particular plight of particular people living in particular places. But the wonderful chapter with exactly that title, Giving and Receiving, from Bob Klitgaard's book from many years ago, deemed one of the best books of the 20th century by the New York Times, by the way, is called Giving and Receiving. And he finishes that chapter by talking about a particular character that's based on a character from one of his books, from one of Steinbeck's books, Cannery Row. And he talks about just how this particular character had a unique ability to receive anything from anyone, to receive gratefully and thankfully, and to make the gift seem very fine. It is so easy to give, so exquisitely rewarding. Receiving, on the other hand, if done well, requires a fine balance of self-knowledge and kindness. It requires humility and tact and great understanding of relationships. In receiving, you cannot appear, even to yourself, better or stronger or wiser than the giver, although you must be wise to do it well. Right? Who talks about aid in that way? Right? Most of us just want to talk about the tools, the instruments, what we can do on a giver side, to try and fix this particular problem, imagining that all the onus is on us, right? Which partly it is, but it's a two-way process. What does the dynamics of receiving look like? How are people receiving this thing called development? How is that being made sense of through their own understandings of how gifts and giving and receiving plays out? Another thing that I think is really interesting is to look at big and small developments. One of my gripe issues at the moment, the fact that I think we've lost a lot of our energy and willingness to be engaged in the big picture issues of development, and are relentlessly defining development down to engage with very narrow specific issues around whether we should charge $1 or $1.50 for malaria nets, or whether we should have solar lanterns be a strategy. We can app our way to poverty reduction and all the rest of it, which has its place. But at the Kennedy School, for example, we have no classes at all that are taught on agriculture. We have no classes that are in our development program that teach serious cost-benefit analysis as applied to big projects. When you take a class on program evaluation now at the Kennedy School, what is it? How to be a good little JPaler, how to be a good little RCT person running around trying to randomize this and randomize that. How to actually assess the impacts of subsidies on rice and how it might affect domestic production. No one studies that stuff anymore because it's not cool. And I think that's my sort of hobby horse moment for the but when you look at how development issues have been rendered in popular culture, you can see some of that on display, I think. David Brooks, who I think otherwise has a fairly high standard deviation as a writer in the New York Times op-ed page, in the high end of his distribution, had a fantastic paper column nearly 2 years ago now, called Sam Spade at Starbucks, which was, he'd just come back from a bunch of these conferences with social enterprise people that were imagining all these great new ideas that they were going to cook up for solving world poverty. And he talked about just how contrasting what you would think about development issues if you were looking at mid-20th century novels, and what they would teach you about what that particular moment conveyed regarding what kind of actors were needed. And so he says, so if I could presumptuously recommend a reading list to help these activists fill in the gaps in their prevailing service ethos, I'd start with the novels of Dashiell Hammett or Raymond Chandler, or at least the movies based on them. The noir heroes like Sam Spade in The Maltese Falcon served as models for a generation of Americans, and they put forth the focus squarely on banality, corruption, and disorder, and how you should behave in the face of it. A noir hero is a moral realist. He assumes that everybody is dappled with virtue and vice, especially himself. He makes no social class distinction and only provisional moral distinctions between the private eyes like himself and the criminals he pursues, blah, blah, blah. I love it when people write like that, right? Because they sort of say, what are they doing? They're conveying very particular types of characters that are able to function in a very particular place at a particular time. And I think that we need to, in some sense, if not go back to that sort of way of thinking, or kind of embodying those kind of characters, at least re-engage with these big picture questions and be willing to take on the very difficult political and political economy challenges that often go with that, and not just see our job as being able to have these laser-like, hyper-targeted, safe interventions in particular places, because I don't think that really is ultimately how poverty gets reduced. Anyway, that's a separate issue. My concluding thing is just another motif that I think is super powerfully conveyed in novels, way better than we ever talk about in everyday development discourse, but this phenomena of leaving and entering, most graphically portrayed in the 1950s by Achabe in Things Fall Apart, right? Written when he was 27 years old, by the way, about what happens to a world that was once internally coherent that starts to fall apart, literally, in the face of its encounter with modernity, and never arrives sort of fully on the other side, and so ends up in this neither here nor there kind of space in which all sorts of very deeply tragic things happen. And I think that is really the leitmotif of the early 20th century, not just mid-20th century, is that we are, just empirically, we're in a hyper-divided space in the world over the lifetime of pretty much everybody in this room. The gaps between the richest and the poorest have just exploded. And part of that, as a part of that package deal, as it were, I think we've created this a lot of sense of where we find ourselves in this netherworld between a leaving space, or a leaving of a once internally coherent space, but not into anything else that we've yet put together, and so find ourselves very discombobulated, literally. I think the best articulation of that actually comes from Ki Hawaja Dintara from 1935, an Indonesian educator, who says, slowly but surely we have become alienated from our own people and our own environment. This alienation would have been bearable had it not been that in our case the abandonment of our own culture did not at the same time bring access to another civilization. Thus we have sacrificed what was ours, but we have not gained in its place anything that might be considered its equivalent. We have lost our world, but we have not yet entered another. We have added much new cultural material, the value of which cannot be discounted. However, it often fits so ill with our own style, or is so far removed from it, that we can use it at best as decoration and not as material to build with. Right? Novelists write like that. You've never seen words like that in an article in the Journal of Development Studies or in a World Development Report, but that's a very deft and profound capturing of what I think we are facing as development professionals and as global citizens in these early decades of the 21st century. A world where, if things aren't literally falling apart yet, they are certainly coming apart economically, and with that one hopes not also culturally, not also socially and politically. And I think it's our guide to that experience, to that encounter, to the way in which that is addressed by hundreds of millions of people, and indeed by 5 out of every 7 people on the planet. We should be far more deferential as necessary, or eager and explicit as development professionals to engage with how those experiences are rendered through popular culture. And let me conclude by where I started by saying, and that does not mean that our social science is wasted. On the contrary, we need to be, as teams of people engaged in this and as individual professionals, far more open to trying to recognize in the first instance that our encounter with evidence, our encounter with a phenomena, our encounter with a sector, with a country, is always and inherently partial. That's the abiding lesson, I think, from popular culture, from the wisdom of the ages, is that we always instinctively want to extrapolate, but from a very narrow base. And the fuller and richer that understanding, the better will ultimately be our stewardship of knowledge. And for those of us, which is, I assume, pretty much everyone in this room, that will at some point in their life preside over real money and real lives and real problems in real countries, that we can do that ultimately in a more careful and a more nuanced and a more sensitive and ultimately a more effective way, if we are not just limited to one narrow domain of inquiry, but we open up to incorporate the others. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Michael. That was absolutely fantastic. Let's take some questions. So we'll take three.
Research associate at IDS. I'm a research associate here at IDS. I'm interested to know how your colleagues, both in the World Bank and in Harvard, react to these ideas and how you can influence them in any way. I just have to say my first course in development was taught by John Mellor, and John said top of the reading list was Blossoms in the Dust by Kusum Nair, and he said, well, I've got to teach you this course, but make sure you read that book if you read nothing else.
Another one? Two more? Roger.
Michael, thank you very much indeed. Could you comment on my suggestion that actually the politicians are the great creative writers and fantasists, not the novelists? Adduces evidence, for example, the idea that Mrs. Thatcher dismantled apartheid in the eulogies for Mandela, and commend the film Mandela for its historical veracity and period truth, and endorse what you said about Chinua Achebe, and commend the entire Heinemann Africa Library actually as source material for your great enterprise.
For the last of this little group, I'm going to read a question from Hannah Wilkinson that came. We'll read a question from Hannah Wilkinson that came via Twitter. She asks, in practical terms, how do we move away from the single story that Adichie warns of? So why don't we hand over to you, Michael, and we'll take another round. Right?
For the sake of broadcasting. Let me say what I said at the beginning, that the first lesson from doing this for me has just been ramming up really quickly against the limits of my own knowledge, my own expertise. I was an English literature undergraduate, among other things, so this has been full circle for me and a nice way of connecting where I was when I was 22. So I actually would prefer to defer some of these questions to and would prefer kind of inputs from people who are vastly more familiar than I am with literature and films from different times and places. As I said, in terms of the first question, how have people in my immediate colleagues? In the first instance, as I said, it's turned out this is a guilty pleasures activity. Most people will only confess that they actually have a deep interest in these things in hushed tones over a drink in a bar somewhere, rather than actually making it a formal, legitimate discussion for an inquiry. The book just came out, so I haven't yet done a launch event at the World Bank. I will be interested to see how that is received if we get around to doing that. We have an opportunity to do one at the Kennedy School in February when David Lewis, my co-author on this, comes across. So I'll get back to you, I guess, in the first instance on that. But whether it's been intentional or otherwise, though, I think when we've looked at the the processes leading up to the World Development Report on gender and the World Development Report on jobs, for example, the World Bank, two of the highest profile big reports the bank has done. Those have been explicitly accompanied by a film series for all staff at the bank on a Friday afternoon from 4 o'clock, where they've had a Films of the World sort of series of seminars where anyone and everyone can come along and just watch a film from Senegal about sort of labour from Ghana on sort of coffee. I mean, it turns out that the networks of the staff at the bank are vast, and they have access to a whole series of really interesting films that they've been able to bring in. Now, whether that's been just seen as sort of something cute, something interesting to do on the side, or a part of a more strategic thing, I suspect probably the former rather than the latter. But my world isn't as brutish as you might think it is. There are actually people really interested in this stuff, and part of what I want to do is just to turn it from an activity done in the shadows and over hushed confessions into something that's not that it certainly not replaces what we do, just saying that it's just a normal part of how we engage with issues, about how we engage with new countries, how we prepare for missions, how we interpret the latest findings coming out from different countries, and how we make sense of even the empirical work that we do. We don't just check it against our own methodological, theoretical expertise, but we truth test it across a broader set of array of ideas. So I guess that's partly an answer to the question from Twitter as well, is that what do we concretely do? Well, as individuals, we can just broaden our diet. That's a good rule of life in our culinary space. I think it's a good rule in terms of our mental and intellectual space as well. And I think we can be more explicit, perhaps either through IDS having a series or giving an award out to people in terms of getting access to people that are doing new things in development. Bring these people here. Don't just see what you do as just narrowly concerned with with focusing on a very narrow aspects of development as we have traditionally understood it. One of the delightful moments and unexpected serendipitous moments for me in this whole process came through an email I got out of the blue from a colleague, a new colleague. It was just random out of the blue at the time, from a guy called Phil Montgomery. Phil is a 25-year veteran working for the Asia Development Bank, doing good old hardcore roads and bridges for ADB. So he's an engineer, good, as you would imagine, sort of straight up development, hardcore guy, lived his whole professional life in developing countries. But he sends me this email saying, thank you so much for writing this book. I am an engineer, but I decided at the end of my career that the only way I could convey the sense of my experience was to write a novel about it. If I wrote what I've actually seen to people in end of mission reports or in notices to my professional associations of engineers, I'd probably be blacklisted. I'd probably never get another contract again. So I found the only way that I could actually do justice to my experiences from the crazy characters, the heroic characters, the venally corrupt characters, the vast assortment of people that I've encountered, was to talk all about this in a particular novel. It's called Two Roads East. You can buy it on Amazon. I encourage you to buy it. Is it a fantastic piece of novel writing? No. But it's a really interesting way in which a development professional, at the end of his whole career as an engineer, equation writing, log frame completing kind of guy, decided actually the best way to talk about all of this stuff was through a novel. The way to convey what he'd experienced to the rest of the world was not just by sticking to his professional domain, was to try the best he could as a non-novelist to write a novel. And that was very special for me, actually, to think, wow, I've legitimized an act by a guy that at the time thought this was incredibly courageous, and it was task to be able to do this, and he published it online, and with all of the risk that this was going to be laughed at or mocked by his colleagues, but he thought this was the right way to do things. So I don't know, I hope that, I'm sure if I was to poll people in this room, there's probably diarists, there's probably people that have insights about the development process that you haven't felt was acceptable to say in a prestigious place like IDS. You thought, no, I'm here to get a PhD, or I'm here to get my department's rankings up the REF. That's partly, that's what you're paid to do. But I think the richer your inputs, the more that you can be explicit about trying to recognize what you can't know and don't know as much as being good about what you can know, that in that other space, that vast space, resides the wisdom of the ages, resides the wisdom of people who are able to articulate that in ways that we can't. And I think we should just take that much more explicitly. And that shouldn't have to be something we apologize for. It should be something that we do as part of our professional practice, as part of ultimately doing a better job about what we think we're supposed to be doing.
Another round? More questions? Melissa.
Thank you. Great presentation. I mean, it does remind me, I think actually stories and popular representations have always been part of the way IDS, or at least large sections of it, have thought about development. I go back to teaching I did on our gender master's course, where reading feminist novels was a very good way into some of these issues. Or indeed more recently, I've been engaging with professors in environmental politics who use science fiction to think about dystopian or utopian futures around biotechnology and planetary disasters. But my question was really about the blurred boundaries, because you've talked very convincingly about, in a sense, the gulf between the development practitioner, or at least what counts as pucker writing in development research, largely as an economist. Now, I come from a different tradition as an anthropologist, and indeed I think many people who come from a social science background have grown up with an idea that when we write about development and about the experiences of development, we're trying to convey, we're writing ethnography, we're writing culture, we're conveying multiple narratives, representations, perspectives, in ways that aren't actually so different from fiction, from the multi-layering in films. So I suppose my question is, to what extent does the book deal with those blurrings, and to what extent, in a sense, are you talking to a quite partial element of the development community in suggesting that there is such a gap?
Another question?
Thank you. I was just wondering, when I saw the examples where you're saying Hollywood and Bollywood, this is like a very mainstream way of presenting issues. And I was wondering if you analyzed a little bit also the, let's say, wrong interpretation of realities, which are transported through media like Hollywood. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. My question goes very much in Michelle's, the question that she just did. I mean, I myself am a person that I've decided to study development in the UK because of British literature. You know, have this 19th century literature on explorers, the Royal Geographic Society, and things like that. Conrad, you just talked about it. And my question is also on the other way around. So how do those representations, or you could say mainstream representations, also influence and shape development practice? Because, I mean, from where I come from, you get this development practitioner, professionals that go out in the field dressed as explorers, and you know, that is still looking for this kind of feeling. Yeah. Brazil. Yeah.
Okay. So first point of clarification, I'm a sociologist. I'm the only one in the research department, so my entire professional post-PhD life has been spent trying to argue for, make a case for, and demonstrate the utility of very different disciplinary ontologies, epistemologies for making sense of this thing called development. That's partly how I got into novels as a way of as a way of doing that. But I'll come back to your question later. I said there were two chapters in the book that David and Dennis and I had done. One on novels, which we were fairly upbeat about, at least what the serious novels had to say. We were much more critical of films, I guess in some sense for the reasons you've just articulated, that yes, on a good day they can be like Even the Rain and actually transport you and convey very profound and complicated truths about how things are going on. But Blood Diamond, another kind of, and Angelina Jolie goes to Mexico, rescues an orphan and brings her back, and the kid's happy and life goes on happily ever after, just reinforces a lot of really unhelpful stereotypes about others, the people, and I think that's part of what we need to engage with on this, is not just because they can be a source of interesting ideas or renderings of ideas that we haven't thought of, but because sometimes there's just pernicious attitudes or values that are being, or very simplistic views that are conveyed that feed into different agendas that we as scholars in this case should be trying to mobilize against. One of the chapters you will remember maybe recall from the outline is an analysis of Band-Aid, of these big concerts that are being done to promote development. I was in my early 20s when the first Bob Geldof conferences, the concerts were held in 1985. Just type into YouTube that and listen to the words of what was deemed to be an entirely acceptable global message, for at least amongst many people, for how we Western countries were going to save the dying masses from Africa, right? And so when on the 20th anniversary of that, there's been 25th anniversary of a lot of that. There's been all this sort of smarter than thou kind of criticism after the fact about how could we possibly have thought that we're so much more enlightened and liberated from our constraints now. We would never have thought about that. So you've probably seen these wonderful satirical cases of Africans for Norway. You've seen that, fantastic, about where these Africans will sing this ode to poor Norwegians stuck up in this frozen tundra up at the top of Europe. How can they possibly survive up there? We have to send them blankets and warm coats because they'll be freezing to death. And it's just a wonderful parody of all that sort of stuff. So I think we've done a good job of sort of self-satirizing or sort of making fun of that. But the much harder question that I posed to a bunch of colleagues on Facebook a few months ago was, if you had to write a 3.5-minute song that we think, if we were to sort of aggregate sort of the sensibility of most people in this room for sort of what we think kind of would be an acceptable message for development, I'm sure we could come up with a really hilarious one to make fun of what we already have. Could we come up with something that was actually more constructive and more informative, that would somehow be able to qualitatively show that, yes, since 1985, our popular renderings of development through these things aren't just reproducing and reinforcing very unhelpful stereotypes about other people, but are in fact trying to portray a much more nuanced and much more encompassing view, shall we say. I don't know, that's a way harder thing. I think we've done okay on the fun and the satire, and it's easy to mock what our previous generation thought was a legitimate and sensible way of trying to raise money or awareness around development issues, but I'm not sure, that was, for all its other content problems, it was a radical innovation to try and do something like that. And what are we trying to do now in ways that would help to provide a more nuanced and a more careful discussion around those kind of issues? So that's what I tend to think now about these kind of issues. But how we, the book itself doesn't. There's only so much we can do. As I said, at the first order of business for this book was to enable this kind of conversation that we're having now to happen, and to be seen as a legitimate thing for people that otherwise spend their lives trying to do the social science of development to incorporate some of this other diversity. So that's the first order of business. So it's a second order issue then for me about how we navigate our way around the different disciplinary spaces and the different epistemological consequences that go with that. Disciplines exist for a reason. They, by definition, represent particular ways of trying to capture reality and trying to portray it to ourselves and to our colleagues and to the rest of the world. So I guess this book in some sense is an exercise in the sociology of knowledge, a wonderful subfield of sociology which is never taught anymore, tragically, but which is very powerful in terms of helping people to understand through concepts like epistemic communities, how people capture a particular reality about the world and then set up whole logics, whole sets of framings that make it entirely sensible within that frame to understand things, but when you step outside of that it becomes incomprehensible. So then again, someone like Umberto Eco is the best articulator of the sociology of knowledge in the late 20th century, because he's able to do that very, very powerfully. But I think part of being educated in this business is aware of the fact that you are putting on lenses every time you do your profession. Every time you represent your discipline, you are talking about a way of engaging with the world, and it makes entirely sense to you. You are surrounded by colleagues that hire and promote you and reaffirm or criticize what you do in a very particular kind of way. That's how knowledge advances. That's how the whole process of progress, dare I say it, happens in knowledge, because we subject it to the community of in a particular epistemological space or a particular epistemic community. I hope this exercise is itself partly a rendering of making us more self-aware of the fact that we are inside that space, and it looks kind of weird when you step outside. And that's phenomenologically very real to me, because for 16 years I've spent my life showing up to work every day, trying to survive amongst a group of very fine, very powerful, very talented, very nice, very able microeconometricians of poverty who spend their life desperately trying to help us get a better handle on how poverty is measured around the world, how we compare poverty across time and space, across different countries, etc. So, but that's helping people to realize that it's great work. It's a way among many of being able to engage with this kind of stuff. And so my career has essentially been possible because I've been able to step inside one world, but also step outside of it as the best I can to try and articulate a different way of thinking about that. And it's not better necessarily, it's just different. And in a better world, those two different ways of understanding converse with each other, and somehow through that process we get a better handle on things. I think that's the essence of the blind man's story. That's the wisdom of many, many centuries of human history, is that if we do that in ways we can't ever anticipate up front, something else happens. And we put it all in together, we stir it all up, and something comes out. And I want to do that with ideas, I want to do that with evidence, I want to do that with theory. And I think that's where, when we're in a business that engages with every country in the world, with every discipline, with billions of dollars and billions of lives at stake, imagining that all of this can somehow be understood through a single lens makes us part of the problem then, rather than part of the solution. And if a book around popular representations of development can help us to pry open that space just a little bit, then it's one humble attempt by 3 people with no money using what convening power they have and the bully pulpits they have to try and expand that conversation. And that's what I can do, and I hope you can join us in that. Thanks. Another question come in. Oh, great. Good.
I read it out?
Yep.
Okay. It's from Dr. Sanjukta Ghosh, and it says, what would be the qualitative difference in evidence between fiction as representation of poverty and of fiction bound by poverty?
And so the last bit?
As representation of poverty and of fiction bound by poverty.
Ooh. Read it again. I'm tired. Help me out.
What would be the qualitative difference in evidence between fiction as representation of poverty and of fiction bound by poverty?
Okay. I'll use my license to interpret the question in a way that I think I can provide a minimally sensible answer. I'm going to interpret the question as saying, is there a distinction between poverty as rendered through novelists which is essentially by one group of people about another group of people, versus how poor people themselves might want to represent themselves through a popular medium, like song, for example, or through painting, or through photography. Yeah, I think there probably is a really interesting difference there. One of my proudest days as a World Bank employee was when one of my senior colleagues in Indonesia figured out that the cost of sending a vice president from Washington to Aceh in the aftermath of the horrible tsunami there a few years ago, and putting him up in an outrageously expensive hotel, was such that he could, for the same amount of money, he could bring 12 Acehnese women from Aceh back to Washington and put them up in Motel 6 up in Rockville somewhere and actually have them talk about to the rest of the organization about what it's like to go through a tsunami and what it's like to experience all of this. So cost neutral, but he decided as an act of leadership on his part that he would use this as his way of trying to help our organisation think about poverty and destitution and deprivation and exclusion through, not so much through their words. These were Achinese widows, some of the most marginalised and excluded women on the planet, just gone through a tsunami, right? So they're at the bottom of a social hierarchy already, and then have a horrible region-wide natural disaster take place to compound everything. But this colleague decided that one way he could do this was it would be not such a great idea to expect these women to come to the 13th floor boardroom of the World Bank and give them a 15-minute speaking slot when they can't even talk in their own village. This wouldn't be an appropriate modality in which they would be comfortable or capable really of fully articulating their experience. But he said what we decided to do in consultation with them was to use photography as a way of helping us to understand their world. So we gave all these 13 women a crash course in photography about how to frame a picture, how to get the light right, how to be able to do the photography 101 essentially, and then gave them all cameras for a week and told just tell us about your world in images, in photographs. And they took the best 40 or so of those pictures, and they took hundreds of them a day across these 13 women, so they had several thousand they could choose from. And the women themselves chose the best ones out of that collection, and then they paid to have them all framed, put little captions with titles and who the photographer was, gave it all the dignity of a professional art gallery presentation, took them into the Holy of Holies at the World Bank, the 13th floor boardroom where all the big decisions are made, portrayed all of these photographs all around the world, all around the walls from these particular women, and then invited every staff member to come in and look at that, while the women themselves who were there were able to enjoy their moment of glory, essentially, by having their work taken seriously by everyone from the president on down. And the only time I've seen this guy ever this in a suit was the day he introduced all of these women, so he gave them all the full dignity of being treated essentially like royalty when they came to the World Bank. Right? It wasn't a dry eye in the room when that was going on. Right? Not a word was spoken almost, but it was using an artistic medium to convey to the rest of us the realities of life from an otherwise highly disadvantaged group of people. Is that social science? Is that going to change policy? Maybe not, probably not in the short run, but it's part of a sensibility, I think, or an attitude that we can try and convey about how we take seriously how other people understand their world, and how often wildly different that is from how we want to explain that in ways that make sense in the epistemic community in which we reside. So I think there is a difference, but I think it doesn't have to be irreconcilable. I think with a bit of leadership, with a bit of initiative, with a bit of courage, one can find interesting ways of being able to bring these different renderings, these different manifestations of knowledge into a common space and respect each other's capacity to be able to engage with that on its own terms, and to be able to use that dialogical process and trust that out of that something interesting and innovative that could never have been come up with any other way to happen. And I think that's something we can do, and that's something leadership we can show, and those are choices we make to not do it that way. And I think when you see it being done in a different way, it's actually really powerful and very fruitful. So.
Hi, Russell Watkins from the Department for International Development. I was going to ask actually about photography, and you've just brought it up in your previous answer. You didn't really mention photography in the sort of remit of the spectrum of popular culture that you look at in the book. Yep. But you also talked about the World Bank using manga comics at the start of the presentation as well. And my question was really about what's the role or place for organisations like the World Bank in as much as they're publishers now, in appropriating popular culture, photography, manga, in terms of the way in which development organisations actually represent development.
Okay. Anyone else?
Ed Clay, I'm now with ODI. One of the things that I looked at in your presentation and I worried about was you called it popular culture. It seemed to me that is problematic, because some of what we might talk about, I mean, if we talk about, let's say, and you mentioned Satyajit Ray, it's culture, but that's clearly not popular culture, in the sense there's an Indian filmmaker who gets a global audience because he wins the Palme d'Or at Cannes, and then he reaches an elite audience. So you see what I mean? So I think that you've got to look very hard at what you're saying when you talk about popular culture, because it seems to me there are many, many things here, and that's problematic. That would be my example, which then leads me to something which you introduced and then didn't take further, which is, this seems to me is also about the political economy of the production of culture as well. And come back to the Ray example to understand how that got into a cultural mainstream in some sense or other. One wants to get into that. And so my question is, in your work, have you tried to explore these sorts of issues?
It's an edited book by 3 people doing this on their weekends because we're not paid to do this kind of stuff. So the short answer is no, but you'll see if you read the introduction that we at least flag in 2 paragraphs rather than 1 sentence at least, that the issues, certainly the second issue that you've articulated, is a real one, and that people with expertise or with time and the knowledge more than we have could really do a really interesting job to look at the political economy of knowledge production in a whole range of different genres. What novels actually do make it? Who does and who doesn't get to be on the shelves that as they're placed in different parts of bookstores? You can think of all sorts of ways. Is an independent film company, as I mentioned before, in a better position to be able to articulate grittier truths rather than Hollywood blockbusters? And one could make a case either way, but a serious content analysis by that would be really interesting. You're exactly right to push back a bit on this, on how we framed it around popular culture. It was just the first order issue that we were really trying to the first order distinction we were trying to make was between sort of, at least in the worlds that David Dennis and I reside in, which is sort of primarily as social science researchers, but who contribute to these more policy-oriented documents for a broader group of development professionals, and just saying whatever other gradations one might make in this other space, nonetheless, this is a really interesting reservoir of materials. Now, yes, as you said, within that, there is sort of a whole, dare one call it a sort of a caste hierarchy between sort of world's worst parents as trashy kind of reality TV stuff down here, and manga stuff for kids somewhere in between, and then Eliot and Dickens and Fielding and Rousseau as sort of what the literati elite will only read, and it certainly wouldn't be called popular in the sense that it's read by everybody else. I guess that in itself then creates a really interesting we call it popular culture because you've rightly pushed back a bit, but you know what I mean. Sort of really interesting to look at how elite films versus popular versus vernacular films, or how it differs in the literal Bollywood sense of what comes out of the Mumbai production versus different. I mean, each Indian state has its own sort of local indigenous film companies. So when you take these issues down into Tamil Nadu and into Karnataka, how do those subnational differences differ, and how does it vary across the multi-million-dollar sort of films that are done versus on a budget with sort of handycams or cell phones that people are now making films? That's another issue we conclude the book with, by the way, is that for the rising generation, for everyone's a filmmaker now. We all can walk around with crowdsourcing different images, and we've got fancy software that can integrate all of that into films. And people can do that through big events like royal births and presidential events. So in all these things, everyone's a filmmaker now. And so there's a hyper-democratizing in one sense of imaging as opposed to words as the basis in which a lot of 21st century communication is going to happen, right? So again, I'm way out of my league once I start getting into that space, but someone in here, this room, probably thinks that can or should be able to respond to that, or in the broader community of development people. So as I mentioned, one of the upsides of this project for me is being able to meet documentary filmmakers whose brains are hardwired completely different to everybody in this room, right? But what they see when they see development is not what no social scientists see. They just look at the lens through which they try and frame these issues is very different. So whether it's the Steven Spielberg sort of level budgets and audiences and markets they're trying to reach, or people in Syria trying to capture the difficulties they're encountering with politics in their own country and trying to put that up on YouTube as a basis for trying to bring about greater accountability and democracy. And all that's now being increasingly done through film. It's an empirical question as to the content, how that content varies. It's an empirical question as to what efficacy this has with regards to changing big questions like political dynamics, or more prosaic questions like adolescent sexual behavior and other things which are really crucial for AIDS and all those other kinds of issues. So as I said, I'm very, I hope, clear that I'm trying to circumscribe the space that I think I'm comfortable and capable of speaking on. That the broader purpose of the book is to say, as per your questioning, that these whole array of issues are out there, and this is how most of citizens get their information about development. It's not through what we do, and we need to take that seriously as a basis on which contemporary politics is being conducted in. How your average median voter comes to know about development, what percentage they think of the national budget is being spent on foreign aid. Every rich country thinks that 20% of its budget is being spent on foreign aid, which is just orders of magnitude wrong. How does that come to be an acceptable, where does that come from? I don't know. Probably because of the way it's talked about in popular culture. So I think that's all part of it for me. So I think I'll leave it at that. I'm around for a little bit afterwards, I guess, so if people want to talk bilaterally or direct, or better yet, there's some markers over here. If you have got a novel from your country or a film that you insist that we should all see because you're clueless about development in my country until you've seen X or read X, stick it up on the board. I'd love to hear about it. Send me an email. If you actually type someone created on Amazon actually for this fiction of development paper a link to all the books that we have in the appendix to all of that, and other people without us even directing it have found ways to be able to sort of create chat rooms or create blog spaces all around my favorite novel of development, and so this is, as I said, vastly beyond our capacity to manage now, but the more that becomes routinized as a way in which we have our conversations about development, I think we'll be the richer and better for it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Michael. You've certainly given us plenty to think about, and I hope you will have, in doing that, started a little conversation within IDS of how we might engage with, in a way, the challenge that you've put forward to us. For those of you who would be interested in hearing Michael talk about another part of his life, there's an extremely interesting video available on YouTube where Michael talks about external validity in impact evaluation, which is another whole side that he hasn't mentioned at all here, and a side that we're quite interested in as Michael will have a relationship to our ongoing work on the Center of Excellence for Impact Evaluation when that finally comes around. So it gives you a whole other window into what he does in his working life.
Speaking tomorrow at ODI on fragile states and how to build state capability, I won't mention novels at all, but that's what they actually pay me to do at the World Bank. But I keep myself interested in development by having these other side things going on, and sometimes they manifest themselves in books.
Good. Finally, I just want to remind everyone that there's refreshments in the back, so please stay around and continue the conversation. So let's put our hands together and thank Michael for